Amelie once had a warm home, a husband who loved her, and a life where she never worried about food or shelter. But when her husband passed away, everything crumbled. His family, instead of protecting her, turned against her. They took the house, the money, and even the little things she held dear. With nothing left, Amelie carried her daughter Zinal in her arms and walked the streets of Durban, begging for kindness that never came. Friends she had once laughed with closed their doors, pretending not to know her. Relatives looked away, ashamed to be seen with her. Each night, as the city lights dimmed, she found herself under the cold concrete of a bridge. The wind stung her face, the ground was hard, and hunger gnawed at them both. Amelie would hold Zinal tightly, covering her with her thin shawl, whispering promises that one day the pain would end. She painted pictures of a brighter tomorrow, a world where her daughter would never have to cry from hunger or sleep on the street. Even in her own tears, Amelie smiled at Zinal, because she knew that hope was the only gift she could still give. Under that bridge, with her dignity crushed and her dreams stolen, she chose to fight silently. Life had pushed her into the shadows, but inside her heart, a small fire burned. She would not give up, not for herself, but for the little girl who looked at her with innocent eyes full of trust. The rain poured down that evening, cold and heavy, soaking Amelie and little Zinal as they huddled together under the bridge. The sound of cars rushing past above them mixed with the thunder, making the night feel even more cruel. Amelie tried to keep her daughter warm with her thin shawl, but the wind cut through it. Zinal's small hands clung to her mother, her eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. Amelie whispered softly, telling her to be brave, when suddenly bright headlights stopped near them. A sleek black car, shining even in the rain, pulled over. Slowly, the door opened, and an old man stepped out. His suit was dry and expensive, his umbrella large enough to shield him from the storm. He did not walk past them like most people did. Instead, he stopped and stared. His eyes first went to Zinal, who shivered in Amelie's arms, then slowly moved up to Amelie's face. His stare was intense, almost painful, like he was looking through time itself. Amelie froze, her heart pounding. She knew those eyes, but she could not believe it. The old man's lips trembled as he spoke her name. "Amelie," he whispered, the sound breaking the storm's roar. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then she saw his face clearly under the streetlight. Wrinkles marked his skin, but his presence was powerful. It was Nkosi Dlamini, her mother's father, the man she had been told never to meet. Amelie's chest tightened. Her mother had spent years warning her, forbidding her from ever seeking him out, telling stories of pride, betrayal, and a family torn apart. And yet here he was, standing in the rain, his eyes soft with regret, his voice shaking as though he carried years of silence on his tongue. Amelie wanted to turn away, to shield her daughter and ignore him, but her body would not move. She felt anger, confusion, and something she had not expected, hope. Nkosi took a step closer, the umbrella stretching to cover her and Zinal too. His voice cracked as he said, "You look just like her, your mother." Amelie's breath caught in her throat. Memories of her mother's warnings clashed with the reality of this powerful man standing in front of her, recognizing her when the world had forgotten her. For the first time in years, someone from her bloodline had spoken her name, and in that storm, Amelie felt her life shift. This stranger with familiar eyes was not just a passerby. He was a door to a past she had buried and a future she could not yet imagine. Amelie stood frozen under the bridge, the rain dripping from her hair as she stared at the old man. She expected him to speak words of pity, maybe offer her money to ease his conscience. But Nkosi Dlamini did not reach into his pocket for cash. Instead, he pulled out a dark leather folder, smooth and heavy, and held it out toward her. Amelie hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling. With Zinal pressed against her chest, she opened the folder under the dim streetlight. Inside were thick papers, stamped with seals, signatures, and official markings. At first, the words blurred together, but as she turned each page, her breath caught in her throat. These were not random documents. They were proof of lies, betrayal, and greed that stretched deep into her family. Nkosi's voice was low but firm as he explained. Her uncle and cousins, the same people who had mocked her and left her to suffer, had been stealing from him for years. Millions siphoned into secret accounts. Property signed over illegally. Businesses stripped for their own luxury. And when their crimes threatened to be exposed, they had needed a scapegoat. That scapegoat had been Amelie's husband. They had planted false evidence, twisted records, and spread lies until his name was ruined. The weight of it hit Amelie so hard she almost dropped the folder. Her husband had died carrying the shame of crimes he never committed, and she had been cast out as the widow of a thief. Her eyes filled with tears, not just of anger but of grief that cut fresh and raw. All this time, she whispered, her voice breaking, they blamed him, they destroyed us, and it was them. She pressed the folder to her chest, her whole body shaking. Nkosi looked at her with sorrow, but there was no softness in his words. The empire that crushed you was built on deception, child. They thought they were clever. But every signature, every stolen cent, is recorded here. And now the truth belongs to you. Amelie felt her knees weaken, but she held herself up, clutching her daughter tighter. The folder was more than paper, it was a weapon, a key, a chance to reclaim her dignity. In that storm, her world turned upside down again, but this time it was not in despair. It was in revelation. The men who had laughed as she begged on the streets had built their wealth on lies, and now their lies were in her hands. For the first time in years, Amelie felt power stirring inside her, a spark that promised the story was not over. It was only beginning. The storm raged on, the water dripping from the bridge above, as Amelie clutched the folder to her chest. Her mind spun with everything she had just learned, but before she could even gather her thoughts, Nkosi's deep voice cut through the rain. He stepped closer, his umbrella now shielding her and Zinel from the worst of the downpour. His eyes locked on hers, sharp but heavy with something she could not name. Then, in a tone that felt like both a command and a plea, he said, "Help me expose them, Amelie. Help me bring their lies into the light. If you do, I swear to you, your daughter will never go hungry again. And more than that, you will inherit the empire they thought they could steal." Amelie's heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it over the storm. The empire. The very thing that had destroyed her life was now being offered to her. But could she trust him? This was the same man her mother had warned her against, the grandfather who had turned his back on her family, leaving them to fight their battles alone. A man of wealth and power, yes, but also a man of secrets. She wanted to scream, to ask why he had come now, after years of silence, after her husband's death, after nights of hunger and humiliation under this very bridge. But then she looked down at Zinel. Her daughter's small face rested against her shoulder, lips parted in exhausted sleep, her thin body shivering even under Amelie's embrace. Amelie's chest tightened. This was no longer about her anger or her pride. This was about giving her child a life where she would never again cry from hunger, where she could grow up free from shame, where she could sit in classrooms and dream without fear of tomorrow. Amelie turned back to Nkosi. The storm was still roaring, but the silence between them was louder. She searched his eyes for lies, but what she saw was a man who had lost control of his own empire and was desperate for redemption. She didn't know if she could forgive him, not yet. But she knew she could not waste the chance he was offering. Slowly, she nodded, her voice steady even though her body trembled. "For my daughter," she said softly, "I will do it." Nkosi's lips curved into a faint, almost broken smile. He reached out his hand, and though Amelie hesitated, she placed her palm against his. Right there under the bridge, drenched and shivering, a deal was sealed. A widow who had nothing just agreed to step into a battle that could change everything. And in that moment, the storm no longer felt like an ending, it felt like the beginning of war. The sun was high when Amelie walked up to the tall gates of the Dlamini estate. Her clothes were still worn and simple, her shoes carrying the dust of the streets, but her steps were steady. In her hand she held the leather folder, pressed tightly to her chest as if it were her armor. The guards hesitated when they saw her, surprised that someone in rags would dare to walk into the place of wealth and power. But when Amelie lifted her chin and said her name, their faces changed. They moved aside, though their eyes lingered on her with disbelief. For years she had been erased, pushed out, forgotten. But today, she was walking back in, not as a beggar, but as a storm waiting to break. Inside, the estate looked just as she remembered: grand walls, marble floors, the smell of money in every corner. But what hit her most was the coldness. Her cousins sat in the living room, lounging in silk robes, sipping expensive wine as if the world belonged to them. The moment they saw her, they burst into laughter. "Look who crawled back," one of them sneered. Another wrinkled her nose and whispered loudly, "Can you smell the streets on her?" Their laughter echoed through the hall like knives. Amelie stood still, her face calm, her silence louder than their mockery. Then her uncle entered, the man who had orchestrated so much of her pain. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her. He let out a harsh laugh. "The beggar girl," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Have you come to ask for scraps? Or perhaps to remind us of your husband, the thief?" His words were meant to break her, but Amelie did not flinch. She held the folder closer, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. For a moment, her silence unsettled them. They shifted in their seats, annoyed that she was not reacting with tears or anger. What they didn't know was that in her hand she carried the truth, every signature and every secret that could strip them of their stolen riches. Amelie's heart pounded, but she stood tall, her gaze steady. She no longer saw herself as the broken widow they mocked. She was the woman holding the knife to their empire, and they didn't even know it yet. As their insults filled the room, Amelie smiled again, calm and unshaken. The folder pressed against her chest was more powerful than all their gold. They thought she was weak, but soon they would learn that the girl they had thrown away had come back, not to beg, but to conquer. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with whispers and the click of cameras. Reporters filled the benches, their pens ready, their eyes sharp. The Dlamini family had always been untouchable, too rich and too powerful to be challenged. But today, Amelie stood in front of them, her worn dress a sharp contrast to their tailored suits. Her uncle smirked at her from across the room, his lawyers standing tall beside him, armed with stacks of files. They thought it would be easy to crush her, to silence her voice with their money and power. The judge called for order, and the trial began. The family's lawyers moved quickly, objecting to every word Amelie spoke, twisting her sentences, painting her as a bitter widow looking for revenge. They laughed as they presented false records, trying to bury her under legal tricks. Amelie listened quietly, her hands resting on the leather folder that held her truth. Her heart raced, but her face stayed calm. She waited, letting them play their game, letting them believe she was small. Finally, when the judge turned to her, Amelie stepped forward. With steady hands, she opened the folder and placed the papers on the judge's bench. The sound of the leather snapping open echoed in the silent room. Page by page, the judge's eyes scanned the documents. The courtroom grew still. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. Gasps filled the air as every fraudulent deal, every stolen cent, every forged signature was revealed. The truth was undeniable. Photos of signed contracts, bank statements, and secret transfers flashed across the courtroom as Amelie spoke with quiet strength. "They destroyed my husband's name to hide their crimes," she said, her voice trembling yet firm. "But these papers prove the truth." All eyes turned to her uncle. The color drained from his face, his confident smirk collapsing into panic. Cameras snapped as the man who had once called her a beggar sat frozen, his empire crumbling in front of him. The judge's gavel slammed down, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Order the seizure of all assets," he declared. Gasps turned into shouts, reporters scrambling to capture every detail. Uniformed marshals stepped forward, their hands on the shoulders of Amelie's uncle and cousins. For the first time, the powerful Dlamini family trembled. Their heads hung low as handcuffs clicked around their wrists. Amelie stood tall in the center of it all, her daughter's face flashing in her mind. The courtroom had come expecting a broken widow. Instead, they witnessed a woman who had turned truth into a weapon. And in that moment, Amelie reclaimed not only her husband's name but her own place in history. The courtroom was still buzzing with chaos when the truth finally settled like a storm after heavy rain. The once powerful Dlamini family was gone from their thrones, dragged out in handcuffs, their empire stripped away in full view of the press. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed non-stop, and yet in the middle of the noise, Amelie stood silently, her daughter Zinal clutching her hand. Beside her was Nkosi Dlamini, the man she had once hated, now standing tall and proud as if finally unburdened. His eyes never left Amelie, and though he said little, the pride in his face was louder than words. Amelie thought the battle was over. She thought clearing her husband's name and bringing the truth to light was the end of her story. But Nkosi was not finished. As the reporters followed them out of the courtroom, he called for silence. His deep voice carried weight, and the crowd obeyed. He pulled a fresh document from his leather briefcase and held it up. This family, he said, his gaze sweeping across the journalists and the stunned onlookers, tried to destroy the rightful bloodline. But today, I set the record straight. Amelie frowned in confusion as Nkosi handed the papers to the court official. The words hit her like thunder when he continued. I have rewritten my will. From this day forward, Amelie and her daughter Zinal are the rightful heirs to my wealth, my estate, and every business under the Dlamini name. The crowd erupted. Reporters screamed questions, cameras clicked faster, and gasps echoed from every corner. Amelie stood frozen, the words sinking in slowly. She turned to Nkosi, searching his face for answers. Her cousins had always believed the empire would pass to them. They had flaunted their power, mocking her in her lowest moments. And now, in one declaration, that power was gone. Everything they thought was theirs now belonged to the woman they had called beggar girl, and the child they had ignored. Zinal tugged on her mother's hand, her small voice breaking through the noise. Mama, does this mean we have a home now? Amelie's eyes filled with tears, and she bent down, hugging her daughter tightly. Yes, my child, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Not just a home. A future. Nkosi placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low but steady. You were always meant for this, Amelie. The empire belongs to you now. Lead it with honor. Amelie looked at the sea of flashing cameras, the stunned faces, and the future unfolding before her. She had walked into court as a broken widow, but she was leaving as the rightful heir. The same bridge where her life had fallen apart had led her here, to an inheritance that was more than money. It was justice, dignity, and a legacy for her daughter. Months passed, and the storm that had once swallowed Amelie's life was now only a memory. The headlines had shifted from scandal to triumph. The name Amelie Dlamini was spoken with respect across South Africa, not as a beggar's name but as the woman who had turned truth into power. One bright morning, she walked into the glass-walled boardroom of the Dlamini Group, her daughter Zinal holding her hand. The long polished table stretched before her, lined with directors and executives, the same men who once whispered insults and laughed at her pain. Now, they stood as she entered, their heads lowered, their voices filled with forced respect. Amelie took her seat at the head of the table. For a moment, she ran her hand across the smooth surface, remembering nights when her bed had been nothing but cold concrete under a bridge. Zinal sat proudly beside her, her little legs swinging from the leather chair, eyes wide as if she already understood the greatness of the moment. The room was silent, waiting for Amelie to speak. She didn't need anger or revenge, her presence alone was enough. The woman they had called beggar girl was now the leader they would answer to. After the meeting, Amelie drove home with Zinal in the back seat. As the car passed under the old bridge, her eyes softened. She remembered the hunger, the tears, the shame. That was where her life had ended, but it was also where her empire had begun. She smiled through the glass, whispering to herself, never again. And with her daughter's laughter filling the car, Amelie knew she hadn't only reclaimed her dignity, she had rewritten her story and secured a future where Zinel would never know the meaning of despair.